Hello, my name is Tong Yang. For this assignment, I will be teaching about functional perspective on group decision making. So, what is functional perspective? The book defines it as a prescriptive approach that describes and predicts task group performance when four communication functions are fulfilled. I will go into detail about these four functions in the incoming slides. For now, we'll focus on the functional perspective. So, what this perspective does is it specifies what communication must be accomplished for jointly made decisions to be wise. To cover a little background, this perspective was coined by Dennis Gorin, a professor of communication at Pennsylvania State University, and Randy Hirokawa, a professor of communication at University of Hawaii at Hilo. They are convinced that group interaction has a positive effect on the final decision. Gordon desires decisions that are appropriate, and he was the one who laid the groundwork for the theory, while Hirakawa is someone who seeks quality solutions, and he was the one who developed the core principles for the theory. So the four communication functions mentioned previously are known as requisite functions. They are conditions of effective decision making. They include analysis of the problem, goal setting, identification of alternatives, and finally evaluation of positive and negative characteristics. So I will start with the analysis of the problem. This defines as determining the nature, extent, and causes of the problem the group is facing. To find a solution, one has to find the problem. The first thing a group must do is to make a realistic look at the current conditions and determine if there is a problem to solve. People tend to think that if something isn't broken, then there is no need to fix it. However, Hirakawa notes that faulty analysis, in this case, failure to recognize that there is a potential problem, will lead to a situation that is compounded when the members make the final decision. After a group has determined that they do have a problem to solve, they can start determining the nature, extent, and the causes of the problem. Next, I will go over goal setting. This defines as establishing criteria by which to judge proposed solutions. What these criteria do is they set forth the minimal qualities that is considered an acceptable solution for the problem. And if a group fails to do this task, their decision making will be driven by power or passion rather than reason and logic. This can lead to conflicts between group members because, with no definitive goals, it is difficult for group members to know whether they are making an appropriate decision. Next, I will go over identification of alternatives. This defines as generation of options to sufficiently solve the problem. It is during this communication function that group members will start to generate what kinds of solutions they may be possible to solve the problem. It is important to note, though, that these options are meant to increase the likelihood of finding an acceptable solution. Any option that is brought up does not have to solve the final solution with certainty. It's just needed to be put on the table so that there's as many options as possible to choose from. And if no one proposes a diversity of options, then the possibility of finding an acceptable solution will be very low. So think of it this way: if there is only one idea that is being proposed, you wouldn't know or wouldn't be able to tell if this is an acceptable idea because there aren't any other ideas to compare it to. Essentially, this step aims to narrow down the options so that there's only one or a few that is most likely to solve the problem. This leads us to the next function that will analyze these options. So the final of the four functions is evaluation of positive and negative characteristics. This defines as testing the relative merits of each option against the criteria selected and weighing the benefits and costs. Hirakawa notes that during this step, things can get a little sloppy, as comparisons between the options against the criteria is not an automatic reaction. Someone in the group has to remind others to consider both the positive and negatives of each of the options that has been put on the table. This will allow the groups to look at the costs and benefits of those options and focus on what is the right balance in the option to be considered appropriate. So after fulfilling the four requisites, groups should be able to come down to a high quality decision regardless of which steps they do, right? Well, that is actually not quite the case. Hirakawa initially thought that there was no sequence in the requisites, but he later discovered that successful group decision making followed a common decision making path. This can be looked at as prioritizing, which defines as addressing the four requisites functions in a logical progression. If you look at the graph, the figure there, for the most successful, a group must start with the problem analysis, then they deal with the goal setting and identification of alternatives, and then by the end, they evaluate the positives and negatives of the characteristics of each option before making their final decision. This will result in a high-quality decision-making. So going back to evaluation of positive and negative characteristics, the term prioritizing can also refer to questioning which function is most important in order for a group to maximize the probability of a high-quality decision. Both Gorin and Hirakawa thought that all the functions were equally as important in contributing to the final decision, but a paper reported on 60 empirical research studies on the functional perspective found that evaluation of the positive and negative characteristics is by far the most important to ensure quality decision. With this, Hirakawa admits being wrong and now has since split the function into positive and negative outcomes, changing the 4 requisite functions to 5 requisite functions. So knowing what we know about the requisites to high-quality decision-making, we also need to look at how communication affects the quality. The book states that the traditional view suggests discussions among members has a significant effect on the quality of group decisions and that verbal interactions makes it possible for members to distribute and pool information, catch and remedy any errors, and influence each other. However, these discussions can have distractions and non-productive conversations that lead to the loss of information. Ivan Steiner, a group professor, claims that actual group productivity is equal to potential productivity subtract the losses due to processes. Essentially, this traditional view suggests that communication is best when it doesn't distort the flow of ideas. Hirakawa doesn't reject this traditional view, but he also has his own beliefs. So Hirakawa believes that conversations play a more active role in decision-making. Instead of communication just negatively impacting the discussion, they believe that communication can also pull the conversation back to being goal-oriented. Hirakawa and Gorin came up with 3 types of communication in decision-making. So there's promotive, which are interactions that move the group toward the 4 requisites of decision-making. Disruptive, which are interactions that divert, hinders, or frustrates the group's ability to achieve the 4 requisites. And finally, counteractive, which are interactions that members use to get back on track, back to the meeting the 4 requisites of decision-making. So Hirakawa believes that during times when the group is being distracted, someone has to say something that will bring the group back on track. So with all that we've learned about functional perspective or functional communication, the right path to high-quality decision-making, along with your interaction that affect the discussions, and what do we do to facilitate for better decision-making? The book states that one should have humility, be able to remain open-minded to differing opinions, and do not hold one's own opinion on a pedestal. Also have clear thinking within the group so that everyone's opinions can be heard. Another is to have reflective thinking, which defines as thinking that favors rational consideration over intuitive hunches or pressures from those with clout. However, despite all of these ideas, sometimes someone of lower status may feel intimidated by someone of higher status, and the book suggests that someone of lower status should raise questions, call for alternatives, and urge for thorough evaluation of evidence. This will allow for someone of lower status to have a higher impact on the quality of the final decision. So in conclusion, a functional perspective is a prescriptive approach that describes and predicts task group performance when 4 communication functions are fulfilled. These 4 communication functions are analysis of the problem, goal setting, identification of alternatives, and evaluation of positive and negative characteristics. It is important to note that for high-quality decision-making, the functions must be taken in this order. And then communication plays a role in quality decision-making as well, and 3 kinds of communication are identified as promotive, disruptive, and counteractive. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation.